I remember the exact moment I realized I was standing on the edge of something I didn't know how to name. He hadn't touched me. He hadn't said anything improper. And yet, the way he looked at me, steady, patient, almost careful, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I was 62, long past the age of foolish decisions. He was older than me. And still, that night, something inside me shifted in a way I could not undo. If you've ever felt something awaken in you when you least expected it, stay with me. And tell me where you're listening from. I have a feeling you'll understand more than you think. I had built my life into something quiet, not empty exactly, but controlled, predictable, safe in a way that didn't require too much from me anymore. At 62, I had learned how to move through my days without asking for anything I couldn't guarantee. My mornings began the same way. Tea in a chipped cup I had owned for nearly 15 years, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, and the kind of silence that settles into a house when no one is expected to walk through the door. I lived alone. That part was simple to explain, even if the truth behind it wasn't. My husband had been gone for 8 years, and while people assumed time had softened the absence, what it had really done was teach me how to live around it. His shoes were no longer by the door, his voice no longer filled the small spaces between conversations, but there were still moments, quiet ones, where I would turn slightly, as if expecting him to be there. Old habits don't disappear, they just grow quieter. My daughter called occasionally, not out of obligation, I never raised her that way, but out of a careful kind of love that had learned to keep its distance. She had her own life, her own worries, and I had made it easy for her to believe I didn't need much. And for a long time, I didn't. My days were filled with small routines, grocery lists written in neat lines, laundry folded the same way I had always done it, afternoon walks that followed the exact same path, past the same houses, the same barking dog, the same old man who sat outside and never spoke. There was comfort in it, or at least that's what I told myself. But comfort, I've learned, can sometimes look a lot like absence. The absence of risk, the absence of disappointment, the absence of feeling anything strong enough to unsettle you. I hadn't noticed how invisible I had become until the day someone looked at me differently. It happened in the most ordinary place. A waiting room. I had gone for a routine checkup, nothing serious, just one of those appointments you schedule because you've reached an age where ignoring your body feels like a gamble you can't afford anymore. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines. A television played quietly in the corner, though no one was really watching. I chose a seat near the window, out of habit more than preference. I've always liked having something to look at, even if it's just a parking lot. He was already there. I didn't notice him at first, not in any meaningful way, just another presence in the room. Older, perhaps, though at my age that distinction becomes less obvious. He sat with a kind of stillness that didn't feel restless or impatient, just settled. It was only when I reached for a magazine and accidentally dropped it that he moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. He simply leaned forward, picked it up, and handed it back to me with both hands, as if the gesture required a certain care. "Here," he said. His voice was low, steady, not loud enough to draw attention, but not hesitant either. "Thank you," I replied, already preparing to return to my quiet corner of the room. But something in the way he looked at me made me pause. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the casual glance people give each other in shared spaces. It was something else. Something deliberate, as if he were actually seeing me, not just noticing that I existed, but taking in the details I had long stopped believing mattered. I felt it immediately, and just as quickly, I wanted to dismiss it. At 62, you don't expect to be looked at that way, not without a reason, not without a misunderstanding. So I did what I had trained myself to do over the years. I turned slightly, broke the moment, and focused on something else. But I could feel it linger. A few minutes passed, then a few more. I tried reading, though I couldn't tell you a single word from the page. My mind kept circling back to something I couldn't quite explain. Finally, he spoke again. "Do you come here often?" he asked. It was such a simple question, harmless even, the kind of thing people say to fill silence. But there was no emptiness in it, no forced politeness. "No," I said, "only when I have to." A small smile touched his face, not wide, not performative, just enough to suggest he understood something behind my answer. "That's probably wise," he said. There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, just open. I don't know why I stayed in it. Normally, I would have let the conversation end there, returned to my quiet, predictable self, but something in me hesitated, as if stepping away would mean losing something I hadn't even realized I was holding. So I asked, "And you?" He looked down briefly, then back at me. "More often than I'd like," he said. There was something in that answer, something that didn't ask for sympathy but carried its own weight. I didn't press. It didn't feel like the kind of thing you question too quickly. Instead, we sat there, not talking much, just sharing the same space in a way that felt different, present. When his name was called, he stood slowly, adjusting his coat with a kind of quiet precision. Before leaving, he turned slightly toward me. "It was nice sitting with you," he said. "Not talking to you, sitting with you. I don't know why that stayed with me, but it did." I nodded, offering a polite smile, the kind I had perfected over the years. "You too," I said. And then he was gone. That should have been the end of it. A brief, forgettable interaction between two strangers passing through the same place. But it wasn't, because that night, as I sat in my living room with my usual cup of tea, something felt different. The silence wasn't the same. It wasn't heavier. It wasn't emptier. It was noticeable. As if, for the first time in a long while, I had something to compare it to, and that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I found myself thinking about him, not in a romantic way, not then, but in a way that made me aware of something I had quietly put away years ago, the part of me that still wanted to be seen. I didn't like that realization. It felt unnecessary, risky, almost inappropriate at my age, so I told myself it meant nothing. Just a passing moment. A coincidence. A brief interruption in an otherwise steady life. But even as I said it, I knew something had shifted. Because for the first time in years, I went to bed wondering if I might see him again. The next time I saw him, it didn't feel like an accident. That's the first thing I admitted to myself, even before I allowed any other thought to take shape. It happened a week later, almost to the hour, in the same waiting room. I had told myself I was only there because the doctor had suggested a follow-up. That was the reason I repeated in my head while I chose the same chair near the window. But when I looked up and saw him already seated across the room, something inside me gave a quiet, unmistakable response. Not excitement, not quite relief either. Just a recognition that felt deeper than it should have. He noticed me a few seconds later. There was no surprise on his face, only a small nod, as if he had expected this possibility and accepted it long before I had. "You came back," he said when I sat down. It wasn't a question. "Apparently," I replied, keeping my tone light, though I felt the same strange awareness settle over me again. This time, the silence between us didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt inhabited. We didn't rush into conversation. That was one of the first things I noticed about him. He didn't seem to need words to prove anything. When he did speak, it came without effort, without the usual urgency people have to fill every empty space. "Do you still sit by the window at home?" he asked after a while. I turned to him, slightly caught off guard. "How would you know I sit by a window at home?" He gave a faint smile. "You chose it here without looking around. That usually means it's a habit." It was such a simple observation, and yet it made me feel studied, not in a way that felt invasive, just careful. as if he paid attention to things most people overlooked. "Yes," I said after a moment. "I do. Windows are honest," he said. "They don't pretend anything is different outside than it is." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I didn't feel the need to question it either. From that day, our conversations began to stretch a little longer, still restrained, still careful, but no longer accidental. We met again the following week, and then again after that. It became something unspoken between us. Neither of us suggested it, and yet we both arrived around the same time, sat in similar places, waited through the same quiet routine as if it had always belonged to us. He learned how I took my tea without ever seeing me make it. I learned that he preferred listening over speaking, but when he did speak, it was always deliberate. He never asked questions that felt intrusive. Instead, he offered pieces of himself slowly, as if placing them on the table between us and allowing me to decide whether I wanted to pick them up. "I used to build things," he told me once, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Structures, homes, mostly. Places people thought they would stay in forever." There was something in the way he said forever that didn't sound like belief, more like memory. "Do you miss it?" I asked. He considered the question before answering. "I miss the intention behind it," he said, "not always the outcome." I didn't ask more than that, but I understood enough. Our connection didn't grow through grand gestures. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden confessions. It was built in the quiet details. The way he noticed when I seemed tired, even if I hadn't said anything. The way he adjusted his pace when we walked out of the building together, matching my steps without making it obvious. The way he remembered small things I had mentioned days before, things I had forgotten I'd even said. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I began to notice something else. My routine was changing, not in obvious ways. I still woke at the same time, still made my tea, still followed the same path on my afternoon walks. But there was a subtle shift underneath it all. I started choosing my clothes more carefully on the days I knew I might see him. I found myself pausing before leaving the house, checking my reflection, not out of vanity, but out of a quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. And the silence in my home. It no longer felt complete on its own. That unsettled me. I had spent years building a life that didn't depend on anyone else. A life that felt safe because it asked nothing more from me than consistency. And now, without meaning to, I had allowed something unpredictable into it. One afternoon, as we sat side by side longer than usual after our appointments had ended, I felt the weight of that realization settle in. "This is unusual," I said quietly. He turned his head slightly. "What is?" "This," I gestured lightly between us. "The way we keep meeting like this." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked ahead as if considering something carefully. "Do you want it to stop?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, and yet it felt like standing at the edge of something I hadn't fully examined. "No," I said before I had time to soften it. The honesty of it surprised me. He nodded once as if that answer had already been understood. "Then perhaps it isn't as unusual as you think," he said. I should have left it there. I should have allowed the simplicity of that moment to remain untouched. But something in me had begun to push against its own boundaries. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you find this unusual?" He looked at me then, fully this time. "Yes," he said. And then, after a brief pause, "But not unwelcome." There was a shift in the air after that. Subtle, but undeniable. Not romantic, not yet, but something closer to awareness. I became more conscious of the space between us. The way our hands sometimes rested near each other on the same surface. The way our shoulders aligned when we sat too close without noticing. Nothing happened. And yet, everything felt like it might. That was the danger. Not action, not words, possibility. I started to question myself more often. What was I doing? What did I think this was? At 62, I should have known better than to let something undefined take root, especially with a man I barely knew. A man who, despite his quiet openness, still held parts of himself just out of reach. And yet, I didn't pull away. If anything, I stayed. Because for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't realized I missed. Not excitement, not even happiness, just presence. And that was enough to make me ignore the quiet warning building in the back of my mind. The warning that something about him didn't fully add up. It came to me one evening, long after I had returned home. He had mentioned something earlier that day. A small detail about his past, the kind of thing most people would overlook. But when I replayed it in my mind, it didn't quite fit with what he had said before. Not a contradiction exactly, just incomplete. I tried to dismiss it, told myself I was overthinking. That at our age, people carry histories that don't always align neatly when told in fragments. But the feeling stayed, and for the first time since I met him, I found myself wondering something I hadn't dared to consider before. What was he not telling me? The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. If it had, I might have recognized it sooner. I might have stepped back, drawn a clearer line, reminded myself of the careful life I had built. But instead, it came in quiet moments. Small shifts that didn't demand attention, only accumulated until they could no longer be ignored. Our conversations deepened, not in volume, but in weight. He began to speak more about his past, though never in full. Pieces of it surfaced in ways that felt both intentional and restrained. "I had a daughter," he said one afternoon, his voice steady but softer than usual. Had. I didn't interrupt, didn't ask the question that immediately formed in my mind. He noticed, I think. "She lives far from here now," he added after a moment. The correction felt deliberate. And yet something in the space between those two statements told me there was more beneath it. "I have a daughter too," I said quietly. He looked at me with a kind of understanding that didn't require explanation. "They worry," he said. "Yes," I replied, "they do." That was the first time I mentioned him to her. Not directly, not openly, just a passing reference during one of our calls. "There's someone I've been talking to," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not long but noticeable. "Someone?" she repeated. "Yes, from the clinic. We just sit and talk sometimes." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "How old is he?" she asked. "Older than me," I said. I don't know why I answered that way. Maybe because it felt like it would make the situation sound less questionable, but the effect wasn't what I expected. "Older than you?" she said, her voice tightening slightly. "Mom, it's nothing," I interrupted more quickly than I intended. "Just conversation." She didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, I felt something shift, concern, not loud, not dramatic, but present. "You should be careful," she said finally. The words weren't harsh. They weren't controlling, but they carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. "I am careful," I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure if it was true, because careful people don't wait for someone they barely know. They don't notice the absence of a voice they've only heard a handful of times. They don't sit in silence at home and feel like something is missing. And yet, that's exactly what I had begun to do. The next time I saw him, something felt different. Not in him, in me. I was more aware, more watchful, as if my daughter's concern had planted something I couldn't ignore. "You seem quieter today," he observed. "I'm thinking," I said. "About what?" I hesitated. "About whether I understand you as much as I think I do." It was the most direct thing I had said to him. He didn't seem surprised. "Do you need to?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Yes," I said after a moment. "I think I do." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." And then he went quiet. Not evasive, not defensive, just still. And for the first time since I met him, I felt a distance between us. Not physical, something else. Something that made me realize that whatever this was, whatever we had been building in these quiet, careful moments, it was no longer safe, because now it mattered. And once something matters, it has the power to hurt you. I should have stepped back then. I should have listened to that instinct. But instead, I stayed. And that was the beginning of the moment where everything started to crack. He didn't come the next time. That was how it began, the unraveling I hadn't prepared myself for. At first, I told myself it meant nothing. People miss appointments, schedules change, lives continue in directions we don't always see. I sat in the same chair, near the same window, holding the same stillness we had shared so many times before. But this time, it felt exposed, like something unfinished had been left behind in the room. I waited longer than I needed to, long enough for the nurse to call my name twice, long enough to realize I was no longer there for a checkup. When I finally left, I carried a quiet weight I didn't know how to place. It followed me home, settled into my evening, and lingered in the corners of my thoughts like something unresolved. The next week, I went back again. Not because I had to, because I needed to know. And this time, he was there. But something had changed. He looked the same, composed, careful, but there was a distance in his posture that hadn't been there before, as if he had already stepped away from something I was still trying to hold. "You didn't come last week," I said before I could stop myself. "No," he replied. No explanation, no apology, just the truth, left where it stood. I felt something tighten in my chest. "Why?" I asked, more softly now. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw something in his expression that unsettled me. Not hesitation, finality. "I thought it would be better," he said. "For who?" "For you." The answer didn't comfort me. It sharpened something I hadn't wanted to name. "You don't get to decide that for me," I said quietly. A small pause passed between us. "No," he agreed, "but I can decide what I offer." There it was, the truth, laid bare without decoration. I waited, my breath held somewhere between understanding and resistance. "I am not free in the way you think I am," he continued. "My life, it's not as open as it may seem." The words settled slowly. "You said you had a daughter?" I reminded him. "I do," he said. "And I have a past that doesn't sit quietly behind me. There are things, responsibilities, that I cannot step away from, even if I wanted to." It wasn't a confession in the way I had imagined. It was something quieter, something heavier. "Then why start this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His answer came without delay. "Because I didn't expect to feel anything either." That was the moment everything shifted, not because of what he had hidden, but because of what he had admitted. We had both stepped into something neither of us had planned, and now we were standing at the edge of what it required. "I won't offer you something incomplete," he said. "You deserve more than that." I should have argued. I should have insisted that what we had was enough. But for the first time, I saw it clearly. Not just him, but myself. The way I had allowed small moments to grow into quiet expectations. The way I had begun to rearrange parts of my life around something undefined. He wasn't taking something away from me. He was refusing to let me settle for less than I needed. So I nodded. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it was honest. That was the last time we sat together like that. There was no dramatic goodbye, no lingering touch, just a quiet understanding that what had passed between us would remain exactly as it was, unfinished, but not meaningless. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't collapse. It didn't need to. Because something far more important had already shifted. The silence in my home was no longer empty. It was aware. My routines returned, but they no longer felt like something I was hiding inside. They felt like something I was choosing. I began to notice things again. The light in the afternoon, the sound of my own footsteps, The way my reflection didn't look as distant as it once had. Even my daughter's voice changed when we spoke. "You sound different," she said one evening. "I am," I replied. And for once, I didn't feel the need to explain it. What he gave me wasn't a relationship. It wasn't even a future. It was something far quieter and far more lasting. He reminded me that I was still capable of feeling something real, that I wasn't finished, that being seen, even briefly, can return a part of you that you thought had disappeared. And that night I mentioned before, it wasn't about what happened between us. It was about what woke up inside me. Because after years of living carefully, quietly, almost invisibly, I finally remembered what it felt like to be a woman who could still be chosen. Tell me, have you ever had a moment that didn't last, but changed you anyway?